Hi, Shaun.
Hi, Will.
How you doing today?
Good, thanks, and thanks for having me on. This is a privilege.
Well, it's a privilege having you on. Thanks for agreeing to do it. I am Will Wilkinson here at the Cato Institute, and Shaun, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
I'm a philosopher at the University of Arizona, and I work mostly in issues about moral psychology, the relation between the way psychology has advanced our understanding of the processes underlying moral judgment and the way people think about free will and other sorts of issues.
And your name is Shaun Nichols, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're at the University of Arizona in Tucson?
Yes.
Is it warm yet?
Oh, God, yes.
But it's dry heat.
Yeah, right. I used to live in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And
not so dry heat.
Yeah, not so dry.
Yeah. Do you like it? How long have you been in Arizona?
I'm just finishing up my second year. And yeah, I like it a lot. Yeah, it's a great place to be.
Great. Well, I always liked it there. I've been to Tucson once. When I was there, I stayed in the guest house of one of your colleagues, David Schmitz.
Oh, is that right? I live next door to David.
You live next door to David?
Yeah.
Well, I stayed in that little bungalow behind his house.
That's great.
He kindly provided for me. Well, let's talk a little bit about your work. You are the author of a book, Sentimental Rules, on the Natural Foundations of Moral Judgment. This came out, 2004?
Yeah.
So here's a copy of it. We're going to do something, I think, that is unusual, Shaun, in that you sent me a copy of your book because we weren't getting any response from your publisher, but then shortly thereafter we got 2 more copies.
Oh, good.
So here's, I think, our first free will book giveaway competition. The first person to write me... I'm going to make it just completely at my discretion. So the person to write me an email about why they should get a copy of Shaun Nichols' Sentimental Rules for free will get one. And now it's a completely subjective criteria. I decide who has the best explanation of why they're in need of this important work of contemporary ethics. But yeah, giving one away. And then I'll still have 2. I can sell one on Amazon or something. Do you know how much it sells for? Because,
I don't, but
I can buy a pizza or something.
It's very generous of you, yes.
But I'm keeping one for sure. So let's talk about your book. It's about the natural foundations of moral judgment. So let's talk about, specifically what makes judgments moral judgments, and try to put your project in the context of contemporary not political philosophy, but moral philosophy. So what's your book is in the sentimentalist tradition. Tell us how it sits within that tradition.
Well, let's see. I guess to start, the issue about whether or not certain kinds of judgments counts as moral is really fraught and difficult, and a lot of philosophers think that it really can't be done, that you can't carve out these neat distinctions between moral thought and other kinds of thought. And I tried to be sort of delicate on that issue in the book. But the sense in which it hooks up to the sentimentalist tradition is that what I argue is that the nature of moral judgment is tied to emotions in a way that turns out to be just empirically well-grounded, that it turns out that there are lots of reasons to think that the way moral judgment proceeds depends in crucial ways on the kinds of emotional activities that we have and the kinds of emotional repertoire that we have from evolution. Now, the philosophical sentimentalist tradition that you get from people like David Hume has a kind of a more ambitious view. The sort of view that they held back then was that there was this one distinctive kind of emotion, and that really captured what moral judgment was. And I'm not so tied to that particular kind of a view, but I really think that the idea that morality is tied to the emotions in a way that's causally really clear and important, that part of the view I think is dead on.
So now, a few episodes of back, I had prominent meta-ethicist Jeffrey Sayer McCord on. We talked a little bit about the distinction between cognitivist and non-cognitivist theories of moral judgment. Now, the sentimentalist tradition would be a non-cognitivist theory. Is that right? When somebody makes a moral judgment, they're doing something that's just they're expressing an emotion, or they're actually making a judgment of fact, or a little bit of both?
it's been the traditional interpretation, at least for the last 50 years or so, that the old sentimentalists were non-cognitivist. Although I'm not so sure. I'm not a historian. It's not clear to me that that's true. It seems like part of what goes on there is that we reread philosophy in the terms of the dominant traditions that we have, and so people had this new distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism, and they read back into people like Hume and said, oh yeah, he's a guy who thought that when people made moral judgments, they weren't doing anything that had any relation to belief or facts. I'm not sure about that. My own take on this is that what's especially important is the role of emotion in influencing the way people make the judgments, and whether or not it's a belief-like judgment or a desire-like judgment or a desire-like state. I don't really have a horse in that race.
And so throughout the 20th century, it's my sense that I don't know if you want to call them all sentimentalist theories, but certain kinds of emotion-based theories were thought to be somehow more scientifically adequate. So if you have a sort of naturalistic bent, throughout the 20th century, you'd be more inclined towards the sort of emotivist views in the 30s and 40s and 50s. People like who are famous emotivists, people like A.J. Ayer or something like that, which was the view that when you're making a moral judgment, basically you're just expressing a positive or negative feeling about it.
Right.
Now, why was that thought to be sort of more sciencey than something else?
I take it's because it looks like you get the kinds of motivational connections with morality that you do. That it turns out emotions look like they're tied up with moral judgment when you just have a quick look at it. But the truth is there wasn't a significant body of science that those guys appealed to. People like Stevenson, they weren't reading the psychological literature at the time. Mm-hmm. It was pretty well divorced from that. That's, I think, a new turn in the last 20 years or so that philosophers in ethics have paid some attention to what happens in psychology.
So, my sense is that back in the sort of early part of the 20th century, the appeal of, emotivism is very closely tied to the reign of a certain kind of logical empiricism or logical positivism, which said something like, in order for a statement to be meaningful, it has to have sort of like verifiable truth conditions or something like that.
Right.
And that moral judgments, when you're like, if you say, I think this is right or that's wrong or this is good or that, where's the rightness, where's the wrongness, where's the goodness, where's the badness? But something that we could look at, something that was completely empirically unverifiable is something like judgments that people make or expressions of feeling. Everybody knows what an expression of feeling is. This is a real phenomenon. So if we give our account of morality in terms of this sort of empirically visible, observable phenomenon, we'll be on safe ground.
Yeah.
Something like that. Now, you say it's a new turn to actually look at the psychological literature about moral judgment. So even when I was in grad school in philosophy, when I started, we would just talk about very general theories. Here's consequentialism, here's egoism, here's, some sort of constructivism or something like that. And then we would assess the adequacy of these things by, using thought experiments, making particular judgments about cases and see if it lined up with what the theory said. Nowadays, it seems like pretty common to, you open up a book of moral philosophy and it's got a lot of talk about experiments with school children. So how did that happen?
Well, I think one kind of sociological explanation here is that a lot of the major moves that were made in traditional ethics, you might have felt like that game had been played out pretty well. And then there was all this work that was being done independently by psychologists that seemed really interesting, that might be able to tell us some new things using new kinds of tools. So people had been using just sort of conceptual analysis, logical tools to try to understand these issues. And now there is a new body of work to bring to bear on it that wasn't supposed to replace the old stuff, but was just supposed to supplement it and give us new ways of looking at these issues. Now, the actual the psychological work that was done, and I think that the work that I became really interested in was done by a guy named Elliot Turiel And he was really inspired by philosophers, so he started looking at how kids made moral judgments. And he thought that various philosophers, had articulated this distinction between morality and convention. And morality was supposed to be something that involved violations of rights or harms, and conventions were supposed to be like socially sanctioned things or socially disapproved of things. And so Turiel thought that he would go and look at little kids and see whether little kids appreciated this philosophical distinction. So the philosophy actually sort of drove the developmental psychology, and now the developmental psychology has sort of come back, I think, to inform some of the philosophical discussions.
Mm-hmm. So he was motivated by, like, Rawls's early work on two concepts of rules, on John Searle's ideas about rules.
Right.
Things like that.
Yeah. And it turned out, I mean, he was a student of Kohlberg, who was the most famous person in the psychology of morality probably in the 20th century. But Kohlberg had this vision of children as basically being really slow to come to appreciate various bits of morality, and it wasn't until they were, practically teenagers before they had some significant facility with moral concepts. But Turiel just went out and asked them really simple questions, like, posing them with various kinds of scenarios, like Billy hits Johnny in the schoolroom, and then he'd say, was that okay? How serious was it? And he'd ask parallel questions about violations of things like school etiquette, like standing up during story time. And so what he found was that if you ask kids, if you say, is it okay for Susie to stand up during story time, they'll say no. But if you ask them, why was it wrong for Johnny to hit Billy, kids will say, well, because it hurts Johnny. And if you ask, why was it wrong for Susie to stand up during story time, they'll say things like, well, it's against the rules, or you're just not supposed to do that sort of thing. And then I think what philosophers, I think, find really interesting is Turiel asked them, well, what if the teacher didn't have a rule against standing up during story time? Would it be okay in that case? And then the kids would say, yeah, if the teacher didn't have a rule against standing up during story time, then sure, she could stand up during story time. But even if the teacher didn't have a rule against hitting other kids, that didn't matter. It was still wrong for Johnny to hit Billy.
So the rightness or wrongness has something to do with an authority who's handing down the rule.
For the social conventions.
For the social conventions.
Yeah,
but
right.
the distinctively moral cases doesn't depend on, it's not authority dependent in the same sort of way.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the idea then is that you shouldn't be able to. So if you ask a kid, I've actually seen some conflicting things about this, and maybe you can tell me what it is. What the right answer empirically is. So if you tell kids that, there's a place, Zimbobo land or something where it's okay to hit other kids on the school ground, and the kids just say like, no, it's not.
It depends on, all of these things, and this is sort of an important thing to stress, they're all comparative. And so what you find is that if you give them the situation that you just described, where you say there's this other place where they hit each other, and you compare responses to that scenario versus responses where there's this other place where they talk during story time, you'd still get the difference. That kids would be more likely to say, well, in the place where they stand up during story time, that's absolutely okay. That you'd find more kids saying that than you would find saying, in this other place it's okay to hit other kids. So it's always comparing between how they respond to the conventional the so-called conventional violations and how they respond to the moral violations.
Now, I've gotten into this just reminded me of this. It's every now and then on my blog, I go off on a tirade about how I don't like Thomas Jefferson. And it has to do with his hypocrisy in being a slave owner, despite the fact that he's made the judgment that it's wrong and does absolutely nothing to free his slaves, and in fact gets himself into enormous debt through his luxurious lifestyle in a way that makes it so that it's impossible for him to ever free his slaves. And whenever I sort of make this sort of argument about the sort of the moral culpability of Thomas Jefferson, I get lots of replies back from people like, well, it's just, it's different. Lots of people had slaves in, 1780s in Virginia. And to me, that sounds like it's a conventionalist account, like a sentiment that it wouldn't be okay to have slaves now. But we can't blame a guy for not freeing his slaves, really, because there's a kind of like moral anachronism going on here.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's actually, especially among university-educated people, there is a strand of relativism that you find about certain things.
But I actually get this from conservative types who want to valorize Thomas Jefferson, the same people who will go on a tirade themselves against relativism.
Usually, I mean, one of the things that's turned out, this is pretty recent work, but it's turned out that for some kinds of minor, well, I mean, I'm not sure this applies to the case of slavery, it probably doesn't, but for minor violations like, well, let's see, maybe it's better to put it the other way. For very, very serious violations like genocide, people will not go relativist. People will not say, oh, yeah, it's okay to kill everybody in a particular race. But then for other kinds of violations like, say, sexual infidelity or something like that, people are more willing to be relativist about that. And so you get, people will jump to relativism for some kinds of cases, but not for others. So even I would bet that your conservative commentators, if you gave them other kinds of cases, they would just say, no, that's beyond the pale. There's no way that, it doesn't matter what a culture thinks, you still shouldn't, kill babies or something like that.
Right, you still shouldn't kill babies, and homosexuality can never be right.
Right.
But call into question Thomas Jefferson's moral character, and everything's up in the air, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of motivated reasoning going on here, too, presumably, right? I mean, I think that's probably what you're getting at. They really want to valorize Thomas Jefferson, and so they want to be able to dismiss all of these kinds of worries.
Well, let's get back to your theory. So there's so Turiel introduces this moral conventional distinction. There's a lot of work that's been done on that, and now a lot of arguments in sort of recent moral psychology use that as a kind of starting place, that if you have some theory about how morality works that doesn't really line up with the data about the way kids make actual judgments about conventional and moral cases, then that sort of weighs against your theory, right?
Yeah, I tend to think that's the case. I think there's dispute in the philosophical literature about that, but I tend to think that, because what I think a lot of what generates the interest in ethics is because it's what we do. It's like it's something people do. It's not just something that they do in Oxford in the common room, that it's something everyday people do. And so coming to understand what it is that's going on when everyday people make these kinds of judgments, if that's the aim of at least meta-ethics, trying to figure out the nature of moral judgment, then ignoring or running up against what normal people do, as is evidenced even in early childhood, that seems to me to be a strike against a theory.
Yeah. So I mean, I find the emphasis on actual sort of empirical data. I mean, it's a really big change in philosophy, and for me, I want to sort of emphasize that because again, I'm not very old, but when I started out in grad school doing moral philosophy, that's not the way it was done, and I'm really interested in how that's happened and how it's sort of starting to kind of take over in moral philosophy in significant ways. So did it really? I mean, I guess it started with a larger program for the naturalization of philosophy that I guess kind of started in earnest with Quine, and then there's a whole sort of history of the naturalization of semantics, right? Where rather than thinking that we're trying to give a naturalistically respectable account for how concepts can mean things, how they can refer to things in the world, and that kind of drove a lot of philosophers of language and mind in a more empirical direction. And then it seems like some of that has started to spill over, trickle down to sort of other areas of philosophy. Is that a sort of a roughly accurate account, do you think?
I think certainly that Quine had a big influence on this, although it's a great irony that Quine himself never really stopped doing a priori philosophy. But the people, so I think of people like Steve Stitch as being the critical, a major figure in developing this push towards paying attention to the science. And Stitch always sort of identified as being heavily influenced by Quine's ideas. And so Quine is really in the background of a lot of this, but because he didn't actually bring the science to bear, I think it's people like Fodor and Stitch who really said, well, now let's pay attention to the psychology and see what it can tell us about the mind or about epistemology and now about morality.
And particularly in moral psychology, I guess there is a strand in in John Rawls's thinking that I know a lot of people have gone back to, where, in the first part of A Theory of Justice, he talks about the sense of justice, or sometimes he calls it our moral capacity, and makes just a footnoted analogy between the moral capacity and Chomsky's then current ideas about the general, underlying linguistic capacity, the sort of universal grammar that underlies all of the grammars of particular natural languages. And I think just mentioning that analogy at some point sparked off something of a research program.
Yeah, for sure. It's huge right now. I mean, people have picked it up from time to time. People would mention it, but really, I guess starting with John McKeil's dissertation in 2000, people have really taken off with this idea that maybe we could use Chomskyan sorts of ideas to get an account of the nature of morality and how it has a lot of internal complexity that can only be explained by saying that there's some kind of innate contribution to it. Yeah, that's been a really influential line of thought over the last 6 or 7 years, I think.
So what do you think about the sort of the more sort of nativist moral capacity views of moral judgment?
I think that at this point there's no good reason to think that the particular rules that we hold are innately encoded. I think that one of the big, so if you're, the sort of view that I like maintains that emotions play an important role in generating our moral judgments, but it's also the case that there's a lot of cross-cultural uniformity, that there are a lot of sort of moral rules that you find everywhere, like rules against rape and murder and theft. And one of the advantages of the nativist proposal, that what they point out, is that you get this really striking amount of convergence, much more so than you get in language, for instance. And so that's a puzzle, and the question is, how do you explain that? That's the one thing that I think that is a pretty moving consideration in favor of a nativist story. But I think that you can get an adequate explanation of it just by the fact that we all have the same basic emotional repertoire, and these particular kinds of rules happen to fit really well with the emotional reactions that we're pretty much built to have, I think. So I think that you can explain why we have this cross-cultural convergence in moral rules just by appealing to the lower-level emotional reactions and those playing the critical role in supporting certain kinds of rules.
So explain to me more in detail what you think is happening when somebody's making a moral judgment. So suppose I see somebody beating up a homeless guy, and I say that's wrong.
Yeah.
Like what's going on in my head and in my gut when I'm making that kind of judgment according to your account?
I think that there are usually two things that are involved in it. One of them is that you have a culturally, you've inherited from your cultural upbringing a particular set of prohibitions that you've learned that, there are certain things you're not supposed to do. And in addition to that, you have a natural sort of visceral reaction to certain kinds of events. And that it's those two things together that generate the kind of psychological process that occurs. So I think, and I should mention here, just because I think the work is so nice, there's this work on psychopaths by James Blair that's on the moral conventional distinction that really is the reason I got into this area in the first place. And what he finds is that psychopaths were children with psychopathic tendencies. I said earlier that normal children, and the ages here are quite young, 4-year-olds, say, well, if the teacher didn't have a rule against hitting, it'd still be wrong for Johnny to hit Billy. Right. Children with psychopathic tendencies are more likely to say, well, if the teacher didn't have a rule, then I guess it's okay for Johnny to hit Billy. And adult psychopaths, if you ask them, why is it wrong to hit other people, the response that Blair found among adult psychopaths were basically, well, you're not supposed to do that sort of thing. Whereas normal adults would say, because it hurts the person, you can't just go up and hit somebody. There's an idea of a deeper sense of it being wrong that you don't get in psychopathy. And Blair's hypothesis is that it's because of a distinctive emotional deficit, that they are less sensitive to other people's suffering. Now, I think that's a critical part of the story about why people make the moral judgments that they do. It's because of these emotions. But I think in addition to the emotions, there are also all of these culturally inscribed rules that we learn from our parents and our peers and our teachers. And if it weren't for those rules, we wouldn't be making the kinds of judgments we would. It isn't enough just to have this sort of gut-level emotion. So that's the kind of picture that I have. So when you see somebody beating up a homeless person, on the one hand, it makes you feel icky. And on the other hand, you think, that is just wrong. People shouldn't do that sort of thing.
Yeah, but there's still some sort of variation. I've been here. Let's talk about Showtime for a minute. I've been watching The Tudors, which is this sort of costume, historical costume porn about Henry VIII. And they're showing these beheadings. So Anne Boleyn's brother is having his head taken off by an axeman, and and everybody in the crowd's like, "Woo, huzzah!" Right? They're loving it. And I don't know if that was really the case, but that's how it's presented. So there's the presentation of some sort of variability over time in people's judgments, and that might be because people at that time aren't, they still have the same emotional repertoire, but they're drawing from a different database of sort of moral rules.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's also clear, and you're totally right to bring this up, that our emotional reactions are at least somewhat malleable, and you can kind of play around with them, and it's kind of fun. I mean, you think about the big deal in art about 10 years ago was all this incredibly disgusting stuff from the British artists, and you think, I remember going to see those
Damien
shows.
Hirst.
Yeah, the Damien Hirst stuff, right? And I remember going to see that, and when I went in, I thought, I'm going to hate this, and I'm going to think it's terrible. But when I came out, I thought, that was actually a more emotionally interesting experience than I've had in a gallery in a long time. Yeah. Even though I wasn't, I was expecting a different emotion when I go to galleries. I expect a different emotion, but at least disgust isn't boring. And so I think
shark, plucked in twain is actually pretty compelling.
Or I particularly like the one with the pig that was cut in half, and it was this little piggy went to market. So I think that you can play with these emotions, but the emotions, I do think, if we didn't have those emotions, we wouldn't have the particular kinds of rules that we do. And so I think that the relationship between the emotions and the rules is actually a lot looser than we might have thought. We might have thought, as the emotivist did, well, the emotions and the judgments are pretty much the same thing. I don't think that's true. The rules are an independent they're an independent vector, as it were, that helps to shape both the emotions themselves and the judgments.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit more. How the judgments, how the rules and the emotions get coordinated over time. But I want to go back to Psychopaths for a minute because it's interesting. Have you watched the show on Showtime, Dexter?
I have watched that. Yeah, I've read those novels too.
Oh, you've read the novels?
Yeah.
I haven't read the novels, but I've been a big fan of the show. Every time I watch the show, I'm thinking about this stuff, because the theory in the show, at least, is basically that he's completely deaf to suffering, right, but we're left to wonder whether this is, somehow native or something that he developed because of a traumatic childhood experience. But do you find Dexter a compelling depiction of psychopathy?
I've never thought about that. I mean, it's entertaining. Is it I really, I'm not sure how close it is. I mean, he cares about some things. Like, he cares about his sister, and he's worried about that, and he cares about the way he's perceived. I guess that's consistent with psychopathy, that there's a lot of sort of self-presentation that goes on in psychopathy. And the other thing that's kind of striking about psychopaths is that they embrace their condition, it turns out. There's this great story, kind of appalling story by a psychopathy researcher tells that he had a patient in a prison once, and the patient had found out that he was diagnosed as psychopathic, and the researcher was worried because the patient was really angry because if they get diagnosed that way, it changes the way they're treated. And he goes in and says, "Why did you diagnose me as psychopathic?" And so the guy went through the list of criteria, and at the end, the psychopath just said, "Well, of course I'm a psychopath. Who wouldn't be? Like, what kind of an idiot? What kind of a sap would do anything else?"
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. I'm in it for me.
Yeah, I know, right.
Yeah, that is kind of scary. Yeah, I mean, for those who haven't seen Dexter, the premise of the show is that Dexter is a forensics guy in the Miami Police Department. He's like he's a blood spatter expert. But the twist of the story is he was adopted by a cop who found him at a crime scene bathed in blood, noticed as he was growing up his kind of psychopathic tendencies, his complete immunity to the suffering of living things. And because he knew that he was going to have these grim fantasies about killing people, he trained Dexter to only use his sort of macabre interest in causing suffering against criminals. So he's got this code that his father set in place, which leads him to be a vigilante serial killer who only kills other killers. It sounds kind of ridiculous, and it kind of is. But it's an enjoyable show. And so the interesting thing about the show, though, in your terms, is that he's got a code. Right, there's a set of rules. Right. So his father sort of programmed his database of rules. Yeah. And he actually is emotively attached to those rules. Yeah. There's some coordination between the rules that his father taught him, and because there's a couple episodes where he deviates from the rules, and it actually causes him a lot of anxiety. Right. And so there's some kind of guilt, even. So he's got some connection to these rules, but there's some other deficit, the insensitivity to suffering. Right. And it's not quite his insensitivity to suffering. He's got a positive kind of attraction. Yeah, right. I don't think that's actually basically one of the indicators of psychopathy. But one of the things that's clear, you're right about the ability to recognize and abide by rules. Psychopaths have that. It turns out that for things like socially inappropriate actions, they recognize those. They're pretty good at that. So one experiment looks at things like asking psychopaths questions about whether. So the story is some guy's standing in a park and he sees a baby crying, a strange baby, and he thinks, oh, my nephew, when he cries, it's usually because there's a pin sticking through his diaper, and so he goes over to fiddle with the kid's diaper, the baby's diaper. Mm-hmm. And then you ask people and psychopaths whether that's okay, and psychopaths are like, no, of course that's not. He can't walk up to some kid and start fiddling with his diaper. Mm-hmm. So they are sensitive to those kinds of things, and they also have the normal sort of anger reaction to that kind of a scenario. Yeah, it's just weird how you can sort of selectively not. So now. Here's the thing that I think kind of disturbs a lot of people about naturalistic accounts of morality at all. So when you're saying that in people's natural judgments, they make a kind of distinction between moral and conventional transgressions, it's not that there is, in fact, written in the fabric of the universe some distinction between these transgressions. It's just people recognize a distinction. Yeah. And so when the psychopath is just sees everything as conventional at a certain level, mm-hmm. It's not that they're sort of missing a deep fact about the universe that's there externally, independent of the constitution of human psychology. It's just that their psychology is constituted differently. Yeah, that I think is the right description, but that's quite controversial, right? Some people would say no. The psychopaths is actually there's some critical fact in the world, or there's some kind of fact of reason that the psychopath is missing. But I think the way you described it is actually much more plausible at this point, that it looks like what we've identified in psychopathy is not a particular deficit in their reasoning abilities. Their reasoning ability, often they have like normal IQs, they have most of the normal sort of cognitive architecture is there. It's just this emotional deficit that they have that's really pronounced. And then that seems to be correlated with their deficit in the way they think about morality. So that's why I think people... That's one of the things that philosophers think we might be able to get out of the research on psychopathy, is that this is a case where we can see that emotions are really doing the work in generating the way we think about morality in this critical respect, that it's independent of authority, that it has this special status as compared to conventional rules. Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about how moral rules come to gain people have to, in order for moral rules to be really effective, they have to feel compelling to people. So I can tell people, I can give people a rule. Here's a candidate rule, which is never call your sister on a Thursday. And they'll be like, why? And I'm just like, it's wrong. And if you say, why is it wrong? It just is. But in fact, there's a lot of things that are kind of like that. A lot of, say, religions have dietary restrictions, which in the end, or a lot of other kinds of behavioral restrictions, that in the end come down to a completely arbitrary assertion of something being wrong.
Yeah.
But those rules have a lot of, people, if they find out that they were, mixing milk and meat or something like that, they might get really upset.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, so how does that rule, which doesn't necessarily have any emotional content, come to gain it?
Well, I think that, this is a good question. There's, I think that the emotions can play a role in two different places, and they can play a role in sort of amping up the value, sort of increasing the gain, as it were, on the rule itself. But then, once you've sort of established the rule, you can also be angered by someone who breaks the rule. And so even with young kids, they draw this distinction between the so-called moral rules like hitting and conventional rules like standing up during story time. But they will get angry and think it's appropriate to punish people who break the conventional rules. And so often it's sort of, one way to read it is, well, why did he get to leave the classroom if nobody else did? So he should be punished for it. And you also get, one of the interesting ways this shows up is in work on how religious groups think about religious rules. And so there's this wonderful work by Larry Nucci on Amish teenagers and how they think about morality versus religious rules. And so if you ask them things like, is it okay to work on a Sunday? And they say no. And they say, is it okay to hit people? And they say no. And then you say, well, what if God didn't have a rule about working on Sunday? Would it be okay to work on Sunday? And in the particular experiment that I'm thinking of, every single kid said, sure, if God didn't have a rule, then it would be fine. But if they said, well, what if God didn't have a rule about hitting other people? Would that be okay? And the vast majority of them said, no, that still wouldn't be okay. Now, probably in both cases, they would think that it would be appropriate for God to punish you. He had the rule. You're not supposed to work on Sunday, and so it would be appropriate for him to punish you if you violate it. But it still has a different status because, again, I think because there's this emotional element to the moral one that you don't have to the conventional one.
Say, is there like a sort of mirror image of psychopathy where you have somebody who basically sees all moral rules or all rules as moral? Nothing's conventional. Like, it's just wrong to jaywalk.
I don't know. It's funny because the data...
It's a logical possibility, so I was just wondering if there's anything like that.
The original data on psychopaths that Blair got is actually, it looks like that. What he found was that the prisoners he looked at were basically moralizing the conventional things. And so they said all of them were extremely serious and didn't matter what the... So they gave moral-like answers to the conventional ones, except when it came to justifications. Now, Blair says that the reason you get this is because they wanted to sort of please the prison guards or whatever. They wanted to please the wardens. They wanted to make it look good, so they tried to show how wrong they thought everything was. But then when you ask them why is it wrong, that's where it sort of really all fell apart, and that's where they said things like, well, it's not the done thing. That's why you don't hit or kill people, because you just don't do that sort of thing. Whereas no normal person would say, you're just not supposed to kill people.
Yeah, so now it's not. You don't think it's arbitrary the way that rules gain their moral content, right? So there's going to be a sort of process over history where rules that tend to have certain kinds of beneficial consequences for the groups that follow them are going to, they're going to be sticky in a way that sort of alternative rules aren't going to be.
Yeah.
So the fact that a rule is contingent doesn't mean that it's not playing some sort of important function.
Yeah. I think that the kind of scenario that you're suggesting, maybe there are kinds of rules that help us to in sort of like market transactions that you might think aren't so dependent on the emotions. I mean, one possibility, this is all really up in the air still in the current literature, but we in the West think of fairness norms. So for windfalls, if somebody in these classic ultimatum experiments where somebody gets $10 and they're told that you have to give some amount to the other person. So you give $10 to the proposer, and so you have to give some amount to the other person. And if they accept your offer, then you both get to keep it. But if they reject it, then neither of you gets anything. Mm-hmm. And so we tend to think that in that scenario, the person who gets the money ought to split it 50-50. And if he doesn't, then the responder probably would be reasonable in saying, I won't accept that deal. And those kinds of norms about fairness and about how to divide up, windfalls, those seem to actually work pretty well, but they're not universal. That there are some tribes where if you give them these kinds of cases, they won't make equitable offers, and the responders will take whatever they get. And the idea that you get these fairness norms, that you should split these things mm-hmm. equally, that might not come about. That norm itself might not come about from emotions. I think it's still unclear why we have those norms, but probably in market economies, they're probably pretty good to have. They probably facilitate interactions.
There's a literature on that suggests that people just have a taste for fairness, and I'm kind of skeptical of that it's that deep. I mean, I think these same experiments that you're mentioning, where they were playing these experimental games in different cultures, when you're playing different kinds of trust games or public goods games. It's really significant that people are most likely to cooperate the more integrated in market interaction they are.
Yeah.
So people tend to think that relative to the sort of natural human default, there's something sort of dog-eat-dog about market cultures. Mm. But it's actually the opposite. that the evidence shows that the more you're integrated in a system with sort of advanced extended economic exchange, the more likely you are to trust and cooperate. Which actually makes a lot of sense. It explains how the institutions that have led to so much sort of growth and economic development got off the ground in the first place.
Yeah.
But it does take, I think, a sort of a readjustment from some people's prior perspective. When I think to me, one of the reasons I got into this whole literature is because I was partly because I had a prior interest in moral philosophy, but also because I was working on a project on economic development for a number of years, and you start ending up with what ends up being sort of like the pessimistic conclusion, which is that culture matters a huge amount. Mm-hmm. So when you want to think at a certain level like a technocrat and just say that here's a set of policies which, if you implement them, will produce growth.
Right.
But it turns out whether or not a certain policy can be implemented at all, or reliably, or effectively, depends on the norms that are prevalent in a particular culture. And it does seem that certain cultures just aren't sort of very well prepared in terms of the rules and norms that they accept to build and sustain certain kinds of cooperative institutions.
Yeah.
And that's really a pessimistic conclusion, but it helps explain a lot once you come to it.
Right. I mean, there's this new study there's this classic study on punishment games where if you allow participants to punish others if they don't contribute to a common fund, this is all done anonymously, then the research had suggested that people will pay to punish others, mm-hmm. and punishment will help, and it will increase cooperation. But recently they did this large cross-cultural version of this study, mm-hmm. and it turned out that there were lots of cultures where people would punish cooperators. They would punish people who were contributing to the common fund, and then this would make the global contributions, the overall contributions, plummet. And so it's this really disturbing effect that just came out in Nature, I think.
Yeah. And you see, a very simple version of that kind of thing, which I don't think it's intended as punishment, but it happens in a lot of developing countries where if I start a little business and I earn a little bit of money, then pretty soon every single cousin I've ever seen shows up asking for money. And it's completely unacceptable for me to not give them some. So any surplus I gain from my entrepreneurial activity is completely wiped out by my obligations to relatives, which completely wipes out the incentive to try to build a surplus from entrepreneurial activity.
Yeah, in
so
the case,
very simple things like that can be a real huge impediment to development.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, briefly, we've got about 15 minutes left, some of your work on free will. So you've got this more empirical approach to moral philosophy, but also to philosophy generally. And so you've done some work on people's intuitions about free will. Tell us a little bit about that. I found it fascinating.
Well, let's see. It was the initial studies I did on children. I was precipitated by my daughter one night at the dinner table. She was just 3 years old, and she blurted out of nowhere. She said, "I can say a bad word. I bet I can." And I thought, what is a 3-year-old thinking like that about? It turns out that I found out the worst word she knew, the one that was sort of at the sort of furthest edge of profanity, was "shut up." So that was, we were spared from her saying "shut up." But then I went out and did these little experiments with 4 and 5-year-olds, looking at how they think about whether or not somebody could have done something else. And it turns out that this is philosophically kind of a complicated idea that somebody could have done otherwise. It turns out 4-year-olds are absolutely proficient with it. They will say, I think there were 3-year-olds in this group too, they will say, yeah, this person did that, but they could have done something else. But they're much more resistant to that idea when it comes to certain kinds of physical events. Mm-hmm. So I did that several years ago, and then there was this paper on just adults, how adults think about free will, that suggested something that I thought was really, I was quite surprised. So what they did is this is work by Eddie Namias. He described a deterministic universe where everything that happens is predictable, that there's a supercomputer that can predict everything that would happen. And he described some particular guy doing something bad, robbing a bank, and then he asked people, should he be blamed? Is he morally blameworthy for robbing the bank? And I would have expected that the answer would be no, because it seems to me, it's always seemed to me that if the universe is determined, if everything that happens is inevitable, then people aren't morally responsible. At least that's my first blush answer. That's not what people said. The majority of people said no, he's still blameworthy. So this made me think that, well, maybe the description of determinism isn't sufficiently salient. So Joshua Noba and I did a couple of experiments where we tried to amp up the description, and we made it clear that the decision was causally inevitable, that from the beginning of the universe, one thing causes another up until a person makes a decision, and that decision had to happen, given what happened before. And then we asked people that in that kind of a universe, are people morally responsible for their actions? And when we asked it that way, people would say no. But then we thought, well, maybe if you ask them these kinds of questions in ways that will engage the emotions in some really salient way, we'd get a different response. And so we described the universe in the same way, that everything that happens is causally inevitable given what happened before. And then we said, so there's this guy in this universe, and he's a serial rapist, and he raped somebody like he's done many times in the past. Is he fully morally responsible for that action? And the majority of people in that case said yes. We got this huge effect that if you ask the question abstractly or in some way that doesn't involve the emotions, people tend to say, oh, not responsible if everything is causally inevitable. But if you ask it in a way that's emotionally really involving, then people will say, yeah, still responsible.
Now, what's your explanation for that? So off the top of my head, I would say that the really emotionally salient case is people are feeling themselves sort of rising to the defense of a norm that's really, really important. And it's important for the coordination of society to keep that norm intact, whether or not people can actually help what they do. And insofar as the norm actually helps deter that kind of behavior, and in which case it's sort of irrelevant in whether or not people can choose whether or not to do it, because the norm itself can help change the relative price of choosing to do it or not to do it. And if people are if the antecedent conditions that determine whether or not somebody does something involves their representation of the payoffs, then maintaining the norm is going to help prevent these acts.
I think that's an interesting hypothesis, and that's consistent with the data. The data don't uniquely favor that one. I mean, what we thought, at least at the time, was that the most plausible explanation was that the emotions, when you get the emotions riled up, you're getting a kind of a biasing effect. And so we know that from lots of other experiments that if you induce emotions, then you can get biases. So in this great experiment by Jennifer Lerner, she has people watch a movie that makes them mad. It's a movie of a bully beating up somebody. And then after they watch the movie, they fill out a survey about some guy who is negligent at a construction site and ends up doing something so that you get hurt. And they asked the subjects how much should he be punished, how blameworthy he is. And it turns out if they'd seen the movie the movie clip that made them angry, then they were more punitive and they would attribute more blame. And this looks like a clear case of bias because, and then in the like ingenious manipulation, she had half of these subjects who were given the anger movie were told, after you're done, you get to go home, you're done. And the other half were told, after you're done, you need to go to a professor down the hall and explain your answer. Mm. And the people who were told that they had to explain their answer, they didn't show the bias. So it looked like, so there it seems like the emotions really are driving a bias. And so we thought that the data at least allow for that interpretation, that when you get yourself really worked up by something terrible like a serial rapist, then you override your sort of calm, cool, collected response to these scenarios.
No, it's actually surprising to me that that describing the causal nature of the universe, that we live in a deterministic universe such that a supercomputer could predict everything that's going to happen given all the laws of nature and the antecedent conditions. That's an incredibly weird, abstract thing to even think about, right? I don't think people ever have any kind of representation of anything like that ever. To the extent that they do, it's probably because they've had some sort of conversation about free will. If everything was determined, then you can't be responsible. But I'm not sure what people's natural intuition. I mean, do people have natural intuitions about what a deterministic universe implies? I don't think is there a natural representation of a deterministic universe? Do people even understand it?
Well, one of the things that, if people just produce noise when you gave them these kinds of questions, then I think that would be the right thing to say is, see, it's just too complicated, people never thought about it. But what we find is that when you describe, a deterministic universe, and of course we never use that word because they don't know what that word means, or we can't assume that they do. You describe that and you contrast it to a universe that's just like that, except that human decision-making is an exception, that human decision-making doesn't have that feature. People overwhelmingly say, our universe is like the one where people's decisions aren't determined.
Yeah.
And I do think this raises a really puzzling question, which is, why do people think that? I mean, what is it that explains?
Well, that's exactly what I used to think. Right. The reason I don't think that now is I thought too hard about how to justify that. So I remember I was taking a seminar on free will, and I decided I was going to write. Started writing some 50-page paper on agent causation, which is this view that there are two different kinds of causation. There's event causation, billiard balls hitting each other, and then there are things that persons do. Right. There's persons are a distinct kind of cause. And so when a person makes a choice, somehow that isn't determined by the same causal laws that's determining everything else. The problem is that at the same time I was developing a very reductively sort of empiricist view of the nature of persons, and those don't fit together very well.
No.
Where you have to see persons as having a special kind of set of causal powers that absolutely nothing else in the universe has. And you end up having to get into some very extravagant philosophy of mind where you have to talk about the amazing emergent properties of human brains that allow us to sort of kind of create a tear in the space-time continuum so that we can do something that wasn't caused by antecedent circumstances. And by the time I got to the end of the paper, I had actually become mystified by why I thought this. I actually started to think it's hard for me to understand why I thought that the fundamental nature of causation has anything to do with whether or not I can be held responsible for choices.
Oh, I see. I think that when it comes to the responsibility question, that's now my considered view, that at the end of the day, probably the right ethical thing to do is to keep the responsibility practices basically as they are, to continue to hold people responsible even if determinism is true. But when it comes to the way we think about choice or agency, what our choices are like, I think that the way we normally think about making choices, people think that their choices aren't determined, that their choices are free in some way that is not determined, some kind of robust way. And I think to say, as some what get called compatibilists do, the way we think about choices is really compatible or ultimately compatible with determinism, that strikes me as sort of bad faith, that there you're just not facing up to the problem. When it comes to deciding how we should act, you might say, well, the way we thought about responsibility turns out to be a little bit wrong, we need to change it. But we just need to face the fact that the way we think about free will is mistaken. And we can't hold on to the views we have about free will. At least this is, I think, that if determinism is true, then that seems like the most likely reaction, the most plausible reaction.
Yeah, but at this point, maybe I've thought myself too deeply into my own position, but it's become... now, I mean, because you understand why, because the experience of freedom, the experience of agency is sort of self-evident, right? Like, I want to touch my nose, I just touched my nose.
Yeah.
Right? And so I can represent alternatives to myself, I can deliberate over them, and my deliberation and the choice that I make as a consequence of that deliberation just obviously causes my action.
Yeah.
So it's obviously true that I'm completely free to deliberate and choose, and that my choice is causally responsible for my actions. And in that sense, I'm responsible for them. But it seems like I don't need to say anything exotic whatsoever about causation to get any of those facts.
I think that you can keep all of that. I agree with that. But people also think, I mean, in both, I mean, it depends on how much you can read into how the kids respond. But I ask questions like, well, if everything was exactly the same right up until the moment the person made a choice, could they have chosen one thing or another? Could they have chose differently? And even little kids will say yes, and adults will say yes. And so it looks like people think that at the moment of choice, you have some kind of purely free ability to go one way rather than another. And what I find puzzling is, why do people think that? What could lead people to have that view of choice? And I think that continues to be an open question.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is a mystery, because I think if you think about it long enough, I think on reflection, and I think this is, I remember hearing, a sort of noted incompatibilist, like I think it was Peter Van Inwagen.
I thought that too.
Argue something like, well, most of our choices aren't in fact free, because we. Most of the time, you're just acting reflexively. You're acting out of habit. Mm-hmm. And so you're not really consciously deliberating and choosing. So, our character does determine most of our choices. But there's still this capacity that if I really think about it, then I can go one way rather than another, irrespective of the entire, prior history of the world.
Right.
But I think, like, if you're Peter Van Inwagen and you're sort of seeing that actually most choices that people make don't meet the conditions for so-called incompatibilist libertarian free choice, then I think most of us should be able to think the same thing, that we really mostly act from habit. We act according to the prevailing cultural and social norms, and I think our judgments actually reflect those things, that we are more or less culpable for different kinds of things. We're more likely to forgive our romantic partner for, being sharp with us if they say, I had a long day, I wasn't feeling well. And that mitigates responsibility somehow, right? And so constantly we're weighing the causal forces on other people and determining how we're responsible to hold them. So if somebody's sitting there in the cool light of morning, deliberating over what they're going to do that day, and they stand up and chop the head off a kitten, right? We're gonna say, "You monster!" But if somebody is just in the heat of the moment does something rash, we think that they get off the hook a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that all can be preserved. You're right, that even if you end up thinking that people don't have the kind of free will we thought they did, we'd still want to make those kinds of distinctions.
Yeah. Now, so some like real hard determinists and a lot of compatibilists will just say, look, the point of holding people responsible is just to have this whole structure of deterrence in place. And I actually find this quite appealing, and partly it appeals to my sort of deeper sort of contractarian political views, that sort of the essence of human sociology has to do with certain kinds of patterns of coordination. And so what we're trying to do is coordinate our activities in certain kinds of ways, and we just need this structure of incentives that gets the pattern right. And whether or not people are fundamentally responsible is kind of irrelevant to getting the incentives right so that we have the optimal pattern of coordination that leaves everyone better off.
Yeah.
And so the function of holding people responsible is because that's a move in this game of upholding this whole system of incentives.
Uh-huh. Yeah, with the hard determinists, it seems like, at least until recently, they were relying on a kind of utilitarian ethics there, though they were saying that, well, we hold people responsible because that produces the most good in the long run. And that, a lot of people think that, boy, utilitarianism is at least intuitively really difficult to swallow because it has all of these awkward consequences about being willing to kill one in order to save two. And so I'm a little worried about just making a quick move to saying, well, we can justify all the practices by their benefiting overall, they're having an overall benefit. But ultimately, I do think that some kind of alternative justification for responsibility should be given.
Well, I think one of the nice things about the sort of like the structural view is that it can actually be quite radical in that it gives you grounds for not holding people culpable for certain kinds of behavior. You can actually, if you can show in a sort of empirically minded sort of way that here's a certain norm, we think that this behavior is wrong, we hold people responsible for it, but look, the norm actually serves no important function. So say like the gay marriage norm or something like that. If you can actually show that changing the norm actually leaves the social order undisturbed, then that's a good reason for that. So this isn't I guess not a good case about responsibility, but it's a good case about sort of moral judgment.
Right.
And there are other things that perhaps people aren't responsible for in a deep sense, where you can show that if we stop holding people responsible for this kind of behavior, the world doesn't fall apart, and it'll actually be easier on these people. So I think
it's interesting that let me just pursue that case a little bit. So, of course, I think gay marriage is fine, but could it turn out that in certain social structures that allowing gay marriages would actually have bad consequences for the social order? So it still turns out to be sort of culturally relative whether or not these norms should be preserved or ditched. Would you say that, Will?
Well, whether or not, I mean, because you can have different social structures in which certain norms play different functions. So in one system, a certain norm might have become a sort of spinning wheel that catches on nothing.
Yeah.
So if you change it, everything else stays the same. In another society, other norms might be sort of densely connected to it, so that if you change it, it radically transforms lots of other things in a perhaps destabilizing way.
Right.
So that does leave you in a sort of you become conservative about your radicalism.
Yes, exactly right.
So if you want to change a fundamental social norm, you need to actually make a very, very strong case that it isn't going to negatively impact other norms that do serve a positive function. And a lot of times the society has to develop in a certain direction for a long enough time for that to become the case. Well, I think we've run out of time. I always find that these discussions start to get interesting right when it's especially interesting at about the time to stop, so it's always frustrating to stop. But thanks, Shaun, so much for coming on, and thanks for a fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, maybe we can do it again sometime soon, now that you've got the technology. But again, for those who are interested in a copy of Shaun's book, Sentimental Rules on the Natural Foundations of Moral Judgment, any poor graduate students out there want to write an entreaty to willwilkinson@gmail.com about why you deserve this handsome book, I will send it to you. Postage and handling, I'll take care of that. All right, thanks, Shaun.
Okay, thanks a lot, Will.
Take care.
Bye.